everybody to the Hinrich Foundation. My name is Deborah Elms. I'm the head of trade policy. On behalf of Hinrich Foundation, I'd like to thank you all for coming in person and for being with us online. Before I get into the introduction of my panel, I just want to say just a tiny bit about what the Hinrich Foundation is for those of you who are new to the space. We were set up by Merle Hinrich, who might wander in. But in any case, he's here most days, which I find amazing, frankly. His stamina is unbelievable. And he's passionate about two things, research and education. So he started the foundation to work on research and education projects related to trade, because it's important for him and for, frankly, all of us, if you just look out our windows, to think about the power of trade to lead to growth and economic development. And so this trade outlook that we're having is part of a series that we started last year, and some of you were here at our last event that we did, so thank you again for coming back. We're trying to do these on a regular basis. We also, just as an FYI, we run a newsletter every Tuesday. If you are not signed up for our free newsletter service, please do so. We will have, I'm sure, a QR code up that you can sign up for if you're not already a subscriber. So with that, let me just say thank you again for coming and get right into our panel. The idea that I had with this panel was, let's not have the panelists talk for too terribly long, because we have a very, I'm assuming, active and engaged audience with a lot of questions. So we're just going to do a few quick sort of opening remarks, and then we'll be opening it up to questions from the audience here live, and also, if I can manage it, the online questions. So if you're online, the Q&A box is supposed to be working. Please put questions in there, and we'll try to group them together and get through as many questions as we can over the next hour. So let me just set a brief bit of context, and then I will introduce and hand over to my two panelists to discuss where we go in 2025. For better or for worse, trade is super exciting in 2025. It's super exciting in 2025 for a whole lot of reasons, and I just want to highlight, of course, some of the, I'm running out of adjectives, some of the things you didn't imagine that you would see in your lifetime, kinds of activities, one of which is likely to hit potentially as soon as this evening for us here in Asia, which is the introduction by the United States of what they're calling reciprocal tariffs. And before we get too far down the path, I just want to give you a flag or a sort of heads up about what this scheme might look like, just so that you can join me in not sleeping this evening. Okay, so what's a reciprocal tariff? The idea here is that we all have roughly 6,000, at a six-digit level, there are roughly 6,000 categories of goods. We're only talking about trading goods. Only Trump cares only about trading goods. 6,000 categories of goods, each one of which has a unique tariff attached to it. It might be zero, it might be higher than zero, it could be 40%, it might be 2%, but each one has a unique tariff. These, as applied to all of us, have been negotiated over decades at the World Trade Organization. Trump wants to undo that system. Well, he wants to undo a lot of things, but one thing he wants to undo is this way in which we're managing tariffs, with something that's now being called a reciprocal tariff. Okay, so how does the reciprocal tariff work? Let's imagine that I have a 5% tariff on an iPad, and you have a 10% tariff on an iPad. This, says Trump, is unfair. Why should we pay more than you do? Our tariff will now be 10% for iPads from your country into the United States. This reciprocal argument only works in the up direction. So the United States is not likely to drop its tariffs. If yours is 0 and mine is 5 or 10, I'm not going to go to 0. So it's reciprocal only in the upward direction, not reciprocal in the downward direction. Now, this is actually far more complicated than it sounds, because there are, again, 6,000 of these tariff lines times 165 members of the WTO. That is almost 1 million permutations of tariffs. So if you think that's confusing enough, let me just add to your, again, why you're not going to sleep tonight. There is this idea now that reciprocal tariffs alone, tariff for tariff, is not good enough. No. We need a sort of a vibe assessment. How bad have you been to our businesses? So it'll be your reciprocal tariff plus some category like an X factor, That's your reciprocal tariff. So it's not just 5% on the iPad equals my 5% on the iPad, but 5% plus, I don't know, you're 7% bad to us. So 5 plus 7, 12. That's the number you get. And it includes stuff like, he's very incensed at the moment about value-added taxes, particularly against the Europeans, subsidies that governments give, non-tariff barriers of all sorts that are all supposed to be somehow rolled up in this X factor, and then reciprocal tariffs. So I'll just give you some heads up about this because I think it's going to be in your inbox potentially tomorrow morning, and you should know something about it before you get out of bed. But also to illustrate like the world that we are trying to anticipate as we look to 2025. Like this is not where we thought we would be when we were planning this event. So I just want to give you a bit of a heads up about the challenges that all folks who are dealing with trade, which is frankly all of us, are facing now, and to ask for, I guess, a bit of grace from our audience if we don't quite know the answer to all sorts of questions, because of course this is unprecedented territory that we're in. So with that brief a bit scaring you, let me turn it over to my panelists to give a little bit more of their own interpretation of where we're at and where we're likely to go. Let me start with Ethan Wu, who, if you haven't met him, because you're relatively new to Singapore, yeah?
Yeah.
Relatively new to Singapore, but he's awesome, which is why we thought he would be a good panelist. Works with The Economist now, used to work with Financial Times, extensive background in Asia. And so let me turn it over to Ethan to give a few minutes of remarks about the kinds of things you're watching or the kinds of things that you're worried about. It can't be too long. We only have an hour, so keep it short.
Yeah, thanks, Debbie, and thanks for the briefing on reciprocal tariffs. I think what Debbie laid out highlights one important fact that we're all feeling, which is that anyone that's interested in trade has their nervous system directly plugged into Donald Trump's nervous system. And that's going to be the basic condition for months, years, indefinitely, who's to say? With that said, I've tried to kind of organize my thoughts, things that I'm watching, things that some of my colleagues at The Economist in Asia have been watching, to just give you a sense of where we're coming from. But I don't think we can pretend that there's any more clarity, than anyone else has on some of these issues. So I think one thing is, across a variety of issues that Donald Trump's taking on, there's sort of an underlying power struggle, in my view, between the people that are China hawks and then the sort of Wall Street and tech folks. And that's on things from export controls to tariffs. All those issues, the ultimate outcome is going to be dictated by how Donald Trump brokers between those factions. And the fact that he's kind of constructed what might have been called in the previous era a cabinet of rivals is quite interesting. Trump likes to hold court. Who has his ear at any given time can change rapidly. I think watching who comes out on top is going to tell us a lot about Trump's decision making and Trump's instincts. A second thing that's especially important in Southeast Asia is, can Donald Trump be bought off with concessions? Is he liable to say, well, you bought enough of our jets and enough of our soybeans or whatever it is, we're holding off on tariffs, right? That is an unanswered question, and I think a lot of countries, especially in this part of the world, are betting the answer is yes, he can be bought off. I was just in Bangkok last week speaking with Thai officials, business people, and the view there, so the Commerce Minister of Thailand was in DC last week talking to top Trump people, and they came with this package of sort of preemptive concessions that the military is going to buy more jets, that they're going to purchase more, that the private sector in Thailand is going to purchase more agricultural exports and other things the U.S. makes. That wouldn't close the trade surplus Thailand has, but it would make a dent and sort of show symbolically, like, we care. We care about your issue, Mr. Trump. Does that work on him? It's completely unclear. And there's also a question of, maybe it works for some folks, but not for others. Maybe Thailand can, pay Trump off and he'll be okay with it. Maybe Europe can't. These questions remain to be seen. Thirdly, and I know Nate's going to get a bit more into this, I'm really interested in the future of export controls, particularly the AI diffusion rule that was promulgated toward the end of the Biden administration. The use of export control power under Biden was, it was continuous with Trump 1, but it was kind of an unprecedented expansion. To what extent will that be deconstructed by Trump 2, or will it expand further? What does that mean for partners like Singapore, which has already gotten in a little bit of hot water with some of the folks in DC around the role in a potential as an intermediary for smuggling of US-controlled chips? So these are all things I'm watching. But I think more importantly than any of those three things is the fact that irrespective of what happens in DC, things continue to occur in the rest of the world that DC will have an impact on, but are independent of what happens there. And I think it's easy to take your eye off the ball of what's happening in other parts of the world, given how much is coming out of DC. So just to rattle off a couple of important things that will impact trade that don't have loads to do with DC. One is Southeast Asia, by and large, is facing industrial stagnation and in some countries deindustrialization. So among the big ASEAN economies, ex-Singapore, which has kind of its own economic model, there's been no increase in industrial production in the past 3 years. In a country like Thailand, it seems industrial production fall by 11% since 2021. Those are really significant changes in the makeup of these economies. They've been driven by import competition with China as one important factor. Countries here are also negotiating trade deals. Thailand EU is supposed to happen this year. ASEAN Digital Framework, I think, is being talked about. ASEAN India is being renegotiated. I mean, there's still, even in this period where the WTO is broken down and there's huge uncertainty about the direction of travel, countries are still trying to work out deals amongst themselves. That continues to happen. There's been a huge change in the global car market for both electric vehicles and traditional ICE vehicles. China's now a dominant player. Japan is losing share across the world. That's something that would have been shocking to say 5 years ago. And it has huge implications for any country that has a leg in the car supply chain, ICE or EV. This was very clear when I was in Bangkok. There's a lot of negative feeling around that particular sector. Thailand's the Detroit of Southeast Asia, so to speak, and it thrived with this kind of Japanese-Thai auto-industrial nexus. That's declining, and the Japanese haven't pivoted as quickly as the Chinese have into some of this newer electric vehicle technology. So that's worth watching too. And just lastly, what happens with the Chinese domestic economy, which has huge implications from everything from the global steel and iron glut to demand for commodities, demand for oil. How hard does China pull the stimulus lever? These are questions that will matter for trade all over the world, and they do have some interaction with DC, but largely that's going to depend on the domestic politics of China. So I think that's all just a way of saying that things are happening in DC, things are happening in the world, and I think just the big point I would make is in a period like this, we need to have humility, we need to have intellectual flexibility, and I've seen, I think in the wake of a lot of the policymaking in DC, sort of endless stream of takes, suggesting that maybe we have some confidence in what's going to happen. And I think my feeling now is we have absolutely no confidence, and we just need to be open to a wide variety of possibilities, especially when it comes to the second and third order consequences of decisions that will be made with imperfect information. So that's sort of where my head is at in the trade outlook, and I'd be keen to know what Nate thinks as well.
Fantastic. Thanks so much. Let me turn now to Nate Bush, who is here in Singapore. He's with DLA Piper. He'll talk about why he can't talk about things DLA Piper is doing and is here in his personal capacity. But he's great because lawyer by training, which I think is useful in trade, but also been here a long time and has the ability to think strategically about issues that, especially for me, are not always top of my mind. And that's, again, for me, the benefit of a grouping like this and a place like the Hinrich Foundation where we can bring diverse views on similar issues related to trade together. So let me turn it over to Nate for some comments.
Well, thank you, Deb, and thank you to the foundation for the invitation and for all of you coming today, whether virtually or present. As Deb mentioned, I have to start with the very explicit disclaimer. I am speaking in my personal capacity. I am not speaking on behalf of my firm or any of the firm's clients. That's critical because these are profoundly sensitive issues in virtually every jurisdiction. So again, I'm a partner with DLA Piper. I lead our Asia international trade and antitrust practices. I started in Washington, D.C., moved to Beijing in 2004, was there for about 8 years, essentially from the end of the WTO phase-in period to the ascent of Xi Jinping. Moved down here in 2012, 2013, and I've covered the region from Singapore since then. My practice is essentially a regulatory triathlon. Over that 20 years, my time has been about equally split between three areas. International trade, from anti-dumping to WTO, and in more recent years, export control and sanctions much more heavily. About a third has been in the competition space. As you all may have seen, during the more optimistic phase of globalization, there was a widespread adoption and spread of competition policy in China and elsewhere. So when living in China, I was involved in a number of the big semiconductor cases that were early in China's agenda and precedent building. And then third, anti-corruption. I moved out soon after the real intensification of FCPA enforcement, so much of my time has been spent doing anti-corruption, anti-bribery, and fraud type investigations in the region. Why do I start with that long intro? Well, first of all, the perspective I bring really is not from a journalistic or policymaking perspective. It's from a mercenary perspective. I have clients that are MNCs. I represent companies. I represent companies based in every continent but Antarctica. And the result of that is the questions that my colleagues and I tackle are not just American, not just Chinese, not just Singaporean. It's a very diverse basket of interests that are tackling a regulatory disruption of the trend lines that people saw for at least 15, 20 years after the fall of the Berlin Wall. So what is keeping me up at night? Well, I think we've already spoken about the general tariff directions. The America First Trade Policy Executive Order really reads like a rubric, like a checklist. It's actually a weapons check. It's an inventory of a wide range of statutory authorities that are available to the US government, many of which are very arcane. There's the actual Smoot-Hawley Act in there. There's elements of the 1916 Act. And then there's very creative uses of other statutes that are being alluded to and hinted in that agenda. And I'm happy to go through some of those regulatory details with you. But at a high level, before we open up the floor, number one, this week I've been flooded by questions about the change in FCPA policy. Why am I talking about the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act in a trade event? It's a trade issue. It's always been a material condition of competition for MNCs and local parties competing throughout this market, throughout Southeast Asia and China. And it's been recognized as a trade issue. It was part of the IPEF agenda. There are anti-corruption elements buried in CPTPP, in MCA. It is a trade issue, and it's been a focus of a number of multilateral law enforcement collaborations over the years. The announcement that was made that there would be a pause and a review of American FCPA enforcement is very surprising for this entire non-trade column of the bar, because it's been a cornerstone of foreign policy for the United States to promote other countries to strengthen their anti-bribery regimes. The stated reason linking an alleged over-enforcement of the FCPA to a national security impairment, mentioning critical minerals access, mentioning access to ports, has an implicit assumption here that US companies have been disadvantaged by that compliance burden that perhaps competitors do not have. That has led to a torrent of questions, including impending FCPA investigations, where clients are saying, well, do we still have to do those interviews? And the quick answer is, number one, statute of limitations is longer than a presidential term. That's important. Number two, there are intervening steps and checks and balances in the system that might redirect that. Third, there's still local authorities, and thanks to evangelism by the US on this issue for a number of years, there are other countries with extraterritorial anti-bribery rules that will step in. So that's something that I'm fielding a lot of questions on this week. Second, as you mentioned, AI diffusion and the advanced semiconductor rules. Really, this is the evolution from kind of the tentative initial reactions to ZTE throughout, essentially the Trump-Biden administrations building a much more elaborate use of export controls as a check on access to advanced IC manufacturing equipment, the advanced IC semiconductors themselves, and now increasingly access to and utilization of the model weights for the most sophisticated, we're told, AI models. This is an element of the AI and semiconductor trade and technology conflict that is getting a lot of attention in many policy realms. At the close of the Biden administration, a very ambitious package of rules were introduced as a interim final rule, and that basically means in U.S. regulatory practice, it takes immediate effect, but some provisions are delayed.
Yeah.
A critical element of this is, if you dig into the details beyond the headlines, are some really ambitious efforts to contain access to this technology, including expansion of the essentially the VEU model, which is going to allow, in theory, data centers placed in, let's say, in not the most closest of U.S. allies and not in the adversarial countries, potential access to semiconductors, advanced AI models, if they meet a battery of regulatory requirements. That battery of regulatory requirements essentially incorporates many U.S. rules that only apply here in the U.S. in terms of use of Chinese technology, collaboration with entities like that. And we can go through that checklist. But a big question to watch in the conflict between the hawks and the tech bros, if you will be how much of that survives, how much of it is fortified, and how practical it proves to be implemented. And we can talk more about the nuts and bolts of that regime. Third area that's being, we're getting a lot of attention to and inquiries on is how MNCs are managing their political exposure in China. And this is potentially largely for the US companies that are in fear of being casualties in the trade war. The first round of Chinese countermeasures was by most, I think by most views, measured less than proportionate, keeping a lot of ammo in reserve. But what it signals is important. Back during COVID, I wrote an article actually on Chinese antitrust as a trade weapon. The use of both the export controls on critical minerals, the unreliable entity list, their counterpart to OFAC sanctions designations, and antitrust investigations alongside tariff measures signals a willingness to go after a wide range of challenges. So I think there are more issues we can dive into, but the quick point would be this is a difficult time and a challenging time for a lot of MNCs, and they're looking to manage both how they structure their business going forward and how they deal with these compliance challenges.
Great. Thank you very much. So we've got a lot of issues on the table, and I'm delighted, really delighted actually, that we didn't have all Trump, because there was a discussion that we had at lunch. Is it going to be 100% Trump? And I said, no, it could probably 80% Trump with 20% of like the implications of Trump on the region. So I'm happy that you came up with some non-Trumpian things to talk about, which is great. But I think it shows you like the impact that we are having from the kinds of activities that Donald is pursuing and what that means for all of us. And even though it's, again, pick your adjective for, do we really want to marinate in this man's head for very long? I don't know. But the point is, it actually has implications for a lot of us and a lot of what you want to do. So especially in the trade space, we unfortunately have to pay attention to this. So I'm going to start to open up to questions. I have one coming in on the chat. So if you are online, please use the Q&A function because I can actually see them. I'm really delighted. Thank you. Thanks very much to the team for organizing this. So I'm going to take some questions. You can think about questions for a second. I'm going to put the first one on the table is one that just came in on the chat, and then I'll take a couple from the floor if we have any here or more that come in on the chat. And then I'm going to have my panel respond. So I'd like to collect a couple at the same time. So the question that came in is a fantastic one from someone who is, I'm not going to read it directly, I'm going to paraphrase, but basically someone who's running a NGO in Cambodia and who is asking, which I think is a very brilliant question, thank you for this one, what are the implications of having USAID cut off overnight? And what happens then to civil society, nonprofits in general? In Singapore, we have less USAID funding in Singapore specifically because of the way USAID is structured. But once you close off funding for development and aid projects by the US, then what happens? So question about USAID. While you guys are thinking, I don't see hands up. I knew I was going to have that. I said, this is going to be such an audience. There's going to be 1,000 questions. I got 3 here. So let me pick 2 more. I'll come to Steve in a second. Can we get a microphone here? Perfect.
Hi, that's Ray from DHL. So question is on the reciprocal tariffs. Do you know how he's going to invoke that? Is he going to use the IEPA provisions, or is he going to use the other, the ones with consultation? So giving us some time to react.
No, you have no time. That's the short answer. I'll come back to it in just a second. A question over here. Fantastic. Thank you very much for using the microphone, or else our online audience can't hear.
Live from the Norwegian Embassy. Trade diversion. You've seen in the past that some countries are closing down their borders as like Chinese goods are being shut off in some markets. Will you see that here in Southeast Asia as well? And in what goods potentially? Thank you.
That's a fantastic question. Wait, do I want to get more? No, we just take 3? Let's do 3, and then it's related to that one. Okay, building on. Wait. Get the.
Just to follow up on trade diversion.
Yes.
Clearly, both the current and former U.S. administrations were aware of the issue of re-exporting trade diversion, particularly meaningful for Southeast Asia. But do we have any information, substantive information, that would suggest that they're planning to take actions on the prevalence of this?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Who wants to go first? Can I answer the reciprocal question first? Because that one's easy.
That's a Debbie question.
The reciprocal tariff question is no, there's no time, I don't think. There might be some time, but it's not because there's some kind of statute that they're using that gives you a clear, like we have 6 months in which you bring in a study followed by responses to the study, followed by draft regulations and responses to the draft regulations. Like that's gone. This is the potential announce, impose, which we saw last week. In the 72 hours of exhaustion last weekend, we had the announcement of tariffs against Canada, Mexico, and China on Friday to be implemented on Tuesday. We waited for the weekend to see where would be the sort of, besides the executive order, where would be the Federal Register and Customs notices. Those were supposed to come out on Monday. On Monday morning, there was an announcement that there was an agreement with Mexico. We never saw the Mexico orders, so they never came out. But in the afternoon, we saw the Canadian one, which was then suspended for 30 days, like the Mexican one. But the Chinese one went into effect on Tuesday night. So from Friday to Tuesday, we had the introduction of tariffs, the suspension temporarily of tariffs, and the imposition of tariffs, followed by the retaliation. So that's a sort of speed with which I think you should expect. Now, I know, because you're going to ask me, can they actually implement this kind of crazy? And the answer is probably no. No, not in the near term, and we saw that, again, we've got we're building up a nice set of evidence here. Nice evidence that this is a crazy implementation had to do with a change in the way the US manages small value shipments called de minimis, which was suspended for all packages coming in from China and Hong Kong to the United States, and then unsuspended 3 days later because the complexity of collecting all of this new tariff revenue from packages that had never had this collected was so overwhelming that the system broke down, basically. So now we are in a suspended moment while they wait until they have the processes in place to actually implement that effectively. But once we have that in place, then we will have the resuspension, right? I guess that's what you would say, the application of tariffs on packages from China and Hong Kong. So it will be fast, it will be furious, it will be a mess. We should all be ready for this. And then we'll see whether it gets removed in whole, in part, but it is going to be, well, a lot of work for Nate's firm for sure, and anyone else especially you as well, anyone in the customs, supply chain, trade compliance space. I've been telling people, if you have someone who's good in trade compliance, double their salary. Because if you have a good trade compliance person or a good legal person to help you with this, they're going to be worth their weight in gold. So, plan to, if you have kids, and they're moving quickly. Supply chain logistics looks like a very lucrative job in the near term. Okay, so that's the tariff question. Let me turn to you two for the other questions, and then I have a bunch more. Thank you for the online people as well.
Yeah, I can take the first and the third. On the question about USAID, I mean, this goes to another power struggle that's happening in DC, which is between Trump's desire to assert federal authority, executive authority, and the extent to which the courts will constrain him. The shutting down USAID, which is an agency approved by Congress, he doesn't have that authority to unilaterally shut down USAID. It's already been challenged. But in the meantime, I think the questioner was from Cambodia. I believe the demining programs have lost funding there. Obviously, the U.S. was involved with the mines being put there in the first place. I mean, in places like Thailand, there have been reports of the refugee camps in the south of the country, which have been there since the 80s, and today host a lot of refugees from Myanmar, refugees from the Civil War. Those have lost funding. I mean, this is having impacts now. The legal process moves slowly, and it may be that there's a temporary loss of funding. The courts say you can't do it. Let's say he says, okay, you got me, and USAID's back up and running again. Then there's a question of, will there be back pay? Will these will the operations that were suspended while there was this big funding question, will they get restored retroactively? It's a serious problem. I mean, there's no way around it. It is a loss of influence for the U.S. in Asia, which I think already under previous administrations there were a lot of questions about. Does the U.S. have an Indo-Pacific strategy that works for the 21st century? And this just kind of piles problems on top of that. I think the China hawks, this is back to my point earlier about the China hawks versus, everyone else. I don't think the China hawks want USAID to be defunded, right? They care about maximal diplomatic leverage against China, and this cuts against that. But the Muskian factions in the administration who believe strongly that there's a deep state that needs to be curtailed. I mean, they've clearly won that battle, at least for now. On the second question about are they actually going to do something about trade diversion through Southeast Asia? I mean, I really wish I knew the answer to that question. What I can say is I was speaking last night to a contact in DC who's a lawyer in the administration, and I'd say he's in the China hawk faction very much so. And he was saying, among his people, the knives are out for Southeast Asia, and the hammer is out for Singapore, was the way that he put it. And I think what he meant by that is, the China hawks see this part of the world as not just China's backyard with a lot of China sympathy, but also, a place for trade diversion, a place for sanctions evasion, a place for getting around export controls. There have been studies, like there was one last year from Harvard Business School studying Vietnam, making the point that, well, there's not actually that much trade diversion. It's been exaggerated the extent to which there's the package comes in, you slap the label on, you change it from China to Vietnam, and it goes to the US. That doesn't happen as much as folks think. I think the question just is, if your ultimate goal is to decouple from China, meaning no links in the supply chain to China going back 3 steps, 4 steps, 5 steps, that the logical conclusion of that is very extreme trade interventions. So it's just a question of how much that argument will win the day in DC.
Picking up on the trade diversion inquiry, one of the things to do with when you tackle that issue is be very careful in segregating several different phenomena. One is Chinese good goes to third country, gets relabeled, re-exported. That's called fraud. Second is Chinese good under a trade remedy order, an anti-dumping, anti-subsidy CVD order, goes to a third country as a result of an effort to get out of that trade remedy order. Basically a Chinese exporter has relocated, is exporting components that need only minor assembly. There's a set of separate long-standing mechanisms in our trade remedy rules that deal with that, and that's anti-dumping, trade remedy, anti-circumvention, different issue. Sanctions and export control evasions going the other way, that's yet another issue, because that's going to become a real question on where along the line did a product pass from one party to another in violation of an export license or one of the EAR implementing rules. And those are areas where prior administration was repeatedly stating that there's an effort to put more resources there. So I don't expect to see any reduction in that activity. What would be a more provocative action, and because we're now in a world of creativity, would be the aggressive look at use of rule of origin. And I think, Steve, when we were in DC last summer, there were some commentators raising questions about how do you deal with Chinese capital, with a Chinese company that has gone to a third country, set up an operation. It may not even be dealing in Chinese inputs. It may be Chinese-owned company that it's still mainland influence. How will that be dealt with? And there are discussions about very aggressive changes to rules of origin and other measures to try and capture that potential scenario. So that would be the kind of the high tide or more aggressive target in the future, but it's not off the table at this point, given what we're saying.
Well, that leads to a great question that Pamela's asked online, which is basically, given the chaos, is it likely that countries just say enough with the United States and they turn away from the US or they turn inward themselves, so that we have this sort of protectionist sentiment, which we have seen that movie before. Let's hope it doesn't end in the same way. But would you turn away from the United States altogether? And what then happens as a result of that? So that's one question. Let me just go through a couple more that are in here that I think are great. One that follows on Nate's question as well was, what happens to existing trade agreements that the United States has? Does it reopen those existing trade agreements? And if so, what does it add? And is it national security additions? We heard a lot about national security and trade in the last administration. At the moment, again, it's very early days, but at the moment, I hear less about national security trade, but that nexus isn't somehow gone. It's just perhaps at the moment a bit less visible. But what do you guys think about that? And then a third question, just to go through some of these that are online, which is, what does this do for, I'm not sure that it makes a difference, but let's ask the question anyways, what does it do for labor mobility in Asia? And then the last question, which has been sitting here for a while, and I definitely should deal with it, what's the story with India? Especially given that Modi is in Washington today. Where's India's role in global trade? India vis-a-vis the United States or others? Just some. There was a very long question, and I apologize for shortening it. What's up with India? Let's start with Nate this time, and then we'll go to Ethan.
All right. Just trying to think of the sequence in which to take those.
Yes, I know they're kind of all over the map, but pick and choose.
So I'll start with India.
Okay.
And I'll go backward. With India, I'll say I'm not seeing as many inquiries with respect to India from the standpoint of their concern about exports to the U.S. and so forth. Ironically, at least some data I've seen has indicated that India is in a bit of a better position than some other countries in terms of how the deficits look. Where I am seeing India questions are having a lot more to do with the diversification issue, where there are companies that were already working on a China plus one model and we're looking at India as a potential destination, following through on that. Companies that are trying to take advantage of India's free trade agreement with ASEAN. And so from a diversification standpoint, that would be one issue on how India could go. Not as much on a legal and technical standpoint. You'll just see a lot of media commentary congratulating or at least commending India on its posture and how it's managing its relationships with many other powers these days. And so, this is an environment where they're probably better situated than many others to take advantage of things. The broader question on what does it mean, or on the national security issue, though, there's always been a national security element of major trade agreements. You'll find national security exceptions in the WTO agreements. That's been a focal point of a number of disputes on whether or not they are self-defined, self-executing by the member state. I saw a very interesting article suggesting that on one hand, that is the right way to read it, but then the injured parties can almost immediately go to a nullification and impairment non-violation claim. But it's always been lurking in the statutes. I think the more practical matter is, in the agreements, if the U.S. starts invoking that radically and saying they're acting consistently with the treaties, it invites other countries to do the same, and that's what we've been seeing already in other markets. So that's would be my concern, is that the practice over time of an expansive use of a national security exception will undermine what's left of many of these multilateral agreements. But one can query how much that matters, at least under current U.S. policy.
Excellent.
I'll take the do countries say enough with the U.S. Quick question first.
Quick one.
Yes, I think the answer to that is no, and almost certainly no. Maybe on the margin, I think there will definitely be hedging away from the U.S. You're seeing that already, but I mean, to me, the fundamental structure of the global economy is that the U.S. is the first and last resort for end demand for products, and that's been true for decades. That the U.S. runs a massive trade deficit with the rest of the world. There's no global trade balances globally, and until there's some kind of fundamental change in the structure of the U.S. economy, I think it's not possible for countries by and large to say I'm done with the U.S. Right? We'll see how much Trump can get done on tariffs. He's clearly trying to leverage the fact that the U.S. buys such a massive amount of goods to extract concessions from other countries. But I think the bar for countries saying we're no longer buying or selling from the U.S. is just extremely high. There's not another America sitting around, right? It's not as if there is really an alternative. On some of the other questions, will the U.S. reopen trade agreements? I mean, I think eventually, if he gets constrained by the courts and runs into limits of unilateralism, I think they may start looking for other options through more conventional policy methods. I mean, I think you saw some of that under Trump 1. But yeah, it's hard to know at what point that kicks in, and certainly if Trump starts defying the courts, then we're in a totally different ballgame.
Excellent. Let me do another round because I had several questions that I left hanging. I've got 2 here in the front.
Hey, Steve Oken. Actually, Ethan, I'm hearing the same from DC that there's the knives are out for Southeast Asia and there's a hammer out for Singapore for the people I'm talking to. At the same time, you look at what China has done when it's come to weaponizing trade with South Korea and the THAAD missiles, Philippines and South China Sea, Australia and COVID. And so here, former Prime Minister Lee or then Prime Minister Lee would say to the US and to China, we don't want to choose. Please do not make us choose. Is that a realistic request anymore? Or we are now at the point where countries are going to have to choose?
Let me get the question back here.
The question is about reciprocal tariffs. Okay, how does reciprocal tariffs work for Mr. Trump?
Well, that's a tough one. Let's see if there's one more question so I can dilute that one for a moment. No? Oh, right here. Well, Blake's got one too. Go ahead.
I'll just say real quickly, one of the natural spillovers of trade uncertainty and the tariff policy of the United States is going to be depreciation pressures across the region globally. At the same time, that probably is not a desirable outcome from the Trump administration. Do we have any idea how they're going to navigate and grapple those tensions?
That is a great question. I'm just going to say before I open back up to these two, you think about this for a second. Just a reminder to everyone, I say this all the time, but I think we really need to keep it top of mind. Governments don't trade, businesses do. And so, you can say as a government, this is what I want to have happen, but ultimately governments are not the ones making those decisions. It's thousands or millions of businesses that are making decisions, and that depends on their own calculation. Now, of course, as we are currently seeing, government can certainly influence the weighting of things for businesses. They can make it impossible or easier for you to do business in a particular jurisdiction. But at the end of the day, it's businesses that decide what they're planning to do and how they plan to do it. And so, again, government can wave a wand and say, this is what I would like to have happen, but it's not automatic. And it leads to this question that I keep raising, but I'm going to raise it again, sort of, what does it mean it's more important than ever. What does it mean to be an American or a Chinese or a Singaporean or a Thai company? And then what does that do for the way in which they interact with the universe, right? Is there a difference between being an American company? What does that look like? And I think those questions are more pointed than ever. Okay, so we got a bunch of diverse questions.
I'll start with Steve's. Do countries have to choose? I mean, they sure hope they don't. When I was in Bangkok last week, what I was hearing vis-a-vis their preemptive concessions to the U.S. is, I asked an ambassador, so what if they tell you, like, thanks for the concessions, here's some tariffs, right? What happens if that's the response? And he said, well, we Thais are very empathetic. We're going to try to understand where they're coming from and find a solution. And that was a very heartwarming answer. But I think it goes to show that there is a profound desire to not choose, and countries will have to be forced by one side or the other into those decisions. If push comes to shove, I mean, they will get their heads together and make a choice, right? And I think countries are able to assess their own interests and have smart people doing that work. But I think they're going to resist as hard as possible to avoid that. I mean, what happens if the U.S. threatens Singapore with sanctions or with some other penalty if they don't do much tighter inspections of shipments to prevent ship smuggling? What then? I think Singapore will comply because they want to be on the U.S.'s good side, and they don't want punishment from a close partner. But yeah, I think that they're going to resist as long as they possibly can. I'll defer to you on the reciprocal tariffs question. On depreciation pressures, I mean, this is sort of the irony of Trump's tariff move, right? Which is that, a lot of the issues he ran on, deindustrialization in the Midwest, and J.D. Vance writing op-eds about how we need to depreciate the dollar and so on and so forth. Trump's tariff plan does the opposite, pushes the dollar up. I buy in theory a smart economist saying, well, Pennsylvania would like the dollar to be weaker so they can reindustrialize and be more export competitive. Yeah, that makes some sense in isolation. Trump doesn't have coherent theories of the world, and to the degree that he has people around him that do, I don't know that they get a hearing. So I think it's worth keeping in mind that we're going to see incoherence, and that's sort of that's just the way it is. It's the world we live in. But yeah, I do think I think central banks in this part of the world will react to support their currencies if that's what they need to. Everyone here lives in fear of 1997. But it is certainly a contradiction within the Trump economic policy.
Such great questions online. So if we didn't answer your question, we'll try to, I don't know if we can get back to people, but we may do some future thing where we put up responses to these because we're not going to get to them all. Let me just take the reciprocal tariff question quickly. I think that one of the challenges is trying to figure out, like, what's the end game? What is it that you're trying to accomplish with a lot of these policies? And I'm not sure that we know exactly, but I do think it's important to remember this Trumpian view, which infuses a lot of policies, including reciprocal tariffs, which is the United States of America has been screwed by the planet for a very long period of time and must take steps to fix that. Now, that sitting outside the United States, I mean, it sounds crazy inside the United States, but it really sounds crazy outside the United States. That is his view. Okay, so you have to start with the world is screwing us, and it is now incumbent upon us to fix this problem. That's important to remember because it helps. I mean, you can't necessarily follow this logic down the rabbit hole, but at least you say, okay, why are we going to do reciprocal tariffs? Part of it is because this is patently unfair to the United States. We haven't had it fixed. We've had non-level, non-even tariffs for a very long time that privileges some companies and countries over others. And we're at the short end of that stick, and we are going to do whatever it takes to fix it. Now, is it going to work? If I were to bet, I would say not in a million years. Is it going to lead to all sorts of implementation and logistics challenges? Of course. But is this the direction of travel? I think so. I think there is, again, if you have that mindset, the U.S. has been screwed, and then you say, what are we going to do? Remember, it's only trading goods. You're going to work on reciprocal tariffs. And so, how far down that path we get remains a bit unclear. Like how effectively can you implement it? You are regularly alienating others. Are they going to come to your assistance in some way? It's unclear. But that's the mindset. So if you think that, then it makes it at least a little more comprehensible where you're trying to go. But there's no magic solution to figuring this out, really. I was joking, I'm going to order one of the magic 8 balls and I'm going to shake it and, what do you think? And then it'll come up and say, I think so. Well, there you go. That's the answer. Yes, comments from the questions that we had on the floor, if you have any. If not, I'll take another batch. Take another batch.
Go ahead.
Blake's sitting here with the microphone.
Thanks very much. Maybe a two-part question. First, taking maybe the dogs that didn't bark in 2024, looking forward at outbound restrictions or things like biosecure. Welcome any views on likelihood of those in 25, 26, or anything else that might be on the shelf waiting to be deployed. And maybe thoughts about when. I think in the past, we've seen kind of the points of great disappointment for the president, that more hawkish camp is able to pull one of those off the shelf and deploy it in sort of those more contentious moments in the relationship, which leads into the second piece, which directly to your comments just now on how tariffs will not restore U.S. unipolarity, which there was a great op-ed today in the FT. When it doesn't, how great is the disappointment? What do you think is the administration response when it doesn't work?
I'm going to build on that one with some questions that are coming in online to say, is there a likelihood, or what are the odds of others coming together, others outside the U.S. coming together in some way to, it's unclear what exactly, stand up to Trump, coalesce in some important way, push forward some integration initiatives, et cetera, but something about what will the rest of the world do when faced with continuing challenges out of the U.S.? So those two questions there. Then we had another one back here. Yeah.
Hi, thanks. Fascinating conversation. I'll add one on top of the one you just said, Deb, which is, I'm wondering what is the constraining factors over time in the U.S. So U.S. stock market, value of the dollar, to the extent parts of the Trump camp care about that or not. U.S. business. I was struck by the Ford CEO's comments recently in the last 24 hours about the trade impacts to their business. But we're looking at, what's the worst case scenario? Not catastrophic, but in the realistic, to the extent you obviously can't predict, but what's the realistic worst case scenario look like for global business? And what would the U.S. Constraining factors be, or are there any?
Wow, that's a good question. Do you want to take that one?
Realistic worst case scenario. I mean, I think that I would call this a tail risk, not kind of my base case, but Trump defies the courts, U.S. rule of law suffers a significant blow, then you have, kind of fundamental uncertainty about the constitutional order. That's like a 10% chance. Is that a realistic worst case scenario? I don't know. That's sort of a semantic debate, I suppose. I mean, that's to me like the really, really scary scenario is like the U.S. institutional order no longer stands. Probably it won't happen. Didn't happen the first time. Trump sometimes has like a low pain threshold and just gives up and decides I'll do something else. So, I think I'd be interested in Debbie's thoughts on this, and you may have thought this out more closely than me. I think he'll be sensitive to inflation, given how much of a campaign issue that was for him, given how much the GOP. I don't know if you guys watch Fox News. I tune in every once in a while, maybe once or twice a week, just to see what's going on. And it was like 4 hours a day, 6 hours a day of coverage was here's a shot of eggs, here's a shot of gasoline, here's a shot of a washing machine. I think he will be sensitive to that. We just got a CPI report that was above expectations. Maybe there's a January effect. We can argue about that. But if inflation's at 3% and tariffs, give you a couple more months of above trend CPI, and then you have the Fed holding pat on rates, and then obviously Trump wants lower rates. That's his real estate developer mentality. Maybe that leads him to reconsider. But I don't feel confident talking about realistic worst case scenarios because I don't think the world of realistic is one we necessarily live in, right? That's sort of my point at the very beginning of like intellectual humility and flexibility is that we have to sort of think in scenarios and entertain really bad downside outcomes as well as like reasonable muddle through midpoint outcomes as very much on the table. On On the question of the odds of the rest of the world coalescing against Trump, I think it's very unlikely. People don't have unified interests, and to the extent they do, maybe you could see some action. I mean, it would be great to see ASEAN put more effort into finding areas of common alignment and working more quickly instead of using the sort of slow train of the actual ASEAN institution to get things done at once every 5 or 10 years. I think people are not used to a world where there is sort of a lack of leadership from the U.S. And we can have an argument about whether it's better or worse, but this is newfound territory for just about everyone. And I think there are going to be too many conflicts of interest between countries to form some kind of coalition. And to Debbie's point, on what really would be the question. On tariffs and U.S. unipolarity, what happens when there's disappointment in D.C.? I don't know. I think they'll just dress it up as a success, right? I mean, that's Trump's superpower, right? Is like he slaps his name on it. Hey, we built it. We built the wall. I don't think they will accept the fact that they failed if that so occurs, right? They'll no president does. Every president, Biden was talking about how Bidenomics was an enormous success and they reindustrialized the Midwest. Look at this battery factory employing 200 people, right? That's just the nature of politics. I mean, a more interesting long-term political question for the U.S. is what happens to the manifest energy on the new right if their political project is seen to fail, if tariffs don't make America great again. That's a deep question and one I don't have an answer to, but it's definitely one to watch.
Yeah. Go ahead. I guess, Blake, going back to your initial question regarding outbound security measures, the basically the outbound investment review and reverse CFIUS. That was on the America First trade policy agenda, was the statement to review the order, the current executive order from the Biden administration and the implementing rules. So I would not be surprised if you see it broadened to a additional menu of destination sectors in countries of concern. But and the other thing that's going in the other direction, also on the menu, was the automated, the connected vehicle rules. And those are essentially the measures that on national security grounds zeroed in on 2 clusters of systems in an EV with autonomous driving capability and said there'd be disclosure and use limitations, not simply if they were made in China, but if they incorporated software and technology and components in various degrees that were attributed and generated by an entity that has an ultimate parent and or is headquartered in China. And this, both that and the outbound investment rules picks up on something that you were asking, like what does it mean to be an American company, to be a Chinese company, to be a third country? The laws and regulations that they're using now are increasingly taking this concept that, from the antitrust world is looking at an ultimate parent entity and aggregating everything that it controls. That concept is being ported into other spaces. And in many ways, you could look at some of the decisions that are being made, or at least the structure under the new AI rules, is looking at specific entities. If you want to get a data center, you want the most advanced chips, you want to put it in Malaysia, well, you have a limited ability at the country level to get the most advanced chips at a country allocation. You want to go higher, you can apply, but you're going to have to qualify based on a lot of compliance and commitments, and many of those are going to go up to your ultimate parent. So that kind of regulatory approach is where I think you may see more expansion, if they stand on this path of scrutinizing more effectively who are you dealing with in third country markets, what are their affiliations, and trying to assert jurisdiction over that. I mean, on the on the unipolarity issue, I would just say, Bob Zellick's responsible stakeholder speech, as many feathers as it ruffled when it came out, it asks important questions. What does it mean if China's going to be a responsible anchor tenant in an international system? When you come to a fact pattern where, arguably most countries are not going to be viewing either of the 2 anchor tenants as acting that responsibly, it does raise questions on whether Japan, Australia, and others will be in a position to show more leadership.
I don't know if we really want to end there. That sounds, I mean, I guess that's where we're at, right? When you have these kinds of outlooks, in the past, you could sort of circle around and you could say, well, there's a lot of unknowns, of course, as life is, full of unknowns, but there's like a direction of travel for certain kinds of things. And we could say, we expect, if we'd done this last year, this, and this might wrap up this year. The intention is we're having a ministerial and such a date, and da, da, da. And you at least had some markers about where things were going to be. And I just think it's much harder now to figure out what that looks like. And again, it's not just the initial reactions typically from Washington, but it doesn't have to be. But then what does that mean for everybody else after that? And so my apologies to those people who are online with some great questions. What we didn't get to, there's many things we didn't get to, but two areas in particular. I don't think we want to extend this because I'm getting a no from back here. There are two areas that were asked in particular, and I'm sure this is top of mind for a lot of places. What happens to us? And in the case of the questions that came in, what happens to a place like Vietnam, which appeared to win in Trump 1? Is it going to win in Trump 2? And if not, why not? So questions like that. But also a lot of questions, and thank you very much again. I apologize for not getting to them, from the European Union, people in the EU. Whether they're individual countries or the EU as a whole, what happens to the EU? And I think it points to this challenge that we're having around coordination. Someone pointed out that in a way we are in a prisoner's dilemma where we would all surely be better off if we cooperated, but the individual incentives for most of the countries is to defect and to do what you need to do in order to save your own skin and then sort of let the system collapse. And in a prisoner's dilemma, you end up with not the best outcome because everyone has incentives to defect. And I think I'm worried that again, this is not how we want to wrap up a trade outlook, but I'm a bit worried that at the end of this, we are all going to defect and we will end up with a very different trade outlook in 2026 because this year will be so fundamentally different. Now, we could be wrong. We could be wrong. That would be glorious. And I would say stay tuned and keep watching the space. We may do this more than once in a year because of the amount of turmoil and chaos that's going on. But again, let me just say, please do sign up for our newsletter. I assume there's a QR code coming up here in just a second. But also, thank you all very much for attending. Thanks so much to Ethan and to Nate for such a great event. And thank all of you, both online, where the numbers, again, are crazy, but also in person, where although you're not online and you can't see this, we have a packed room here as well. So I think it points to the importance of trade and the trade agenda in this time of growing uncertainty. So I please stay tuned. And thank you all very much for coming.